Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Theresa May has promised she'll kick off Brexit negotiations with the EU by the end of March, and after months of shadow boxing, the real haggling will begin. Ellie Price reports on the battle to come over the UK's Brexit bill and the likely costs and savings once we've left.
It was the figure that defined the EU referendum campaign. They even put it on a bus. It was also a figure that was fiercely disputed. But the promise, vote leave, and Britain won't have to pay into the EU anymore. So, is that what's going to happen now? The trouble with buses is you tend to have to wait for them. And when Theresa May triggers Article 50, the clock starts ticking on a deal. She needs something quicker, something more sporty. According to the most recent Treasury figures, Britain's gross contribution to the EU, after the rebate is taken into account, is about £14 billion a year. Now, there are some complicating factors that means it can go up or down year on year, but that's roughly how much the UK will no longer be sending to Brussels post-Brexit. But there are other payments that Britain will have to shell out for. First and foremost, the so-called divorce settlement.
It is being said, and openly, by Commissioner Barnier and others in the Commission, that the total financial liability as they see it might be in the order of 40 to 60 billion euros on exit.
The BBC understands the figure EU negotiators are likely to settle on is far lower, around 34 billion euros. But what does the money they're going to argue over actually cover? Well, there's how much Britain owes for stuff in the EU budget is already signed up for until 2020, 1 year after we're expecting to leave. Historically, Britain pays 12% in contributions, so the cost of the UK is likely to be between 10 and 30 billion euros. Then they'll look at the 200 to 250 billion euros of underfunded spending commitments, the so-called RAL. That's another 26 billion euros. Britain could also be liable for around 5 to 7 billion euros for its share of the pensions bill for EU staff. That's again 12% of an overall bill of 50 to 60 billion. Finally, there's our share of the assets held by the EU. They include things like this building, the European Commission headquarters in central London. Britain could argue it deserves a share back of around 18 billion euros from a portfolio that's said to be worth 153 billion euros. So, lots for the two sides to discuss in 2 years of talks.
They have a great opportunity with the Article 50 talks because actually they can hold us to ransom. They can say, you figure out the money, we'll talk about your trade. But until you figured out the money, we won't. So I think many European states think they're in a very strong negotiating position at the moment and they intend to make the most of it.
BBC News at 2 o'clock.
The principle is clear. The days of Britain making vast contributions to the European Union every year will end.
Stirring words, but are they true? Theresa May has already indicated that she would want to sign back up to a number of EU agencies on a programme-by-programme basis. Europol, for example, that's the European Crime Agency, or Erasmus+, which runs student exchanges. If everything stayed the same as it is now, it would cost the UK 675 million euros a year, based on analysis by the Sunday Politics. But there are likely to be agencies we don't choose to participate in. If we only opted back to those dealing with security, trade, universities and, say, climate change, it could come with a price tag of around 370 million euros a year. Of course, that's if our European neighbours allow us. I wonder if they're going to let me in. There'll also be a cost to creating a new system to resolve trade disputes with other nations once we're no longer part of the European Court of Justice. Take the EFTA Court, which rules on disputes between the EU and Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. That costs €4 million to run each year. Though, in the Brexit white paper published this week, the government said it will not be constrained by precedent when setting up something new. Finally, would the EU get behind the idea of Britain making some contribution for some preferential access to its market?
The sort of thing that Theresa May seems to be hinting at are sectoral arrangements, some kind of partial membership of the customs union. There's no real equivalent to that. Switzerland, which has a far less wide-ranging deal than Norway, pays about 320 million a year for what it gets into the EU budget. But it's not exactly the Swiss deal that we're after, and the EU institutions hate the Swiss deal because it's codified in a huge number of treaties that are messy, complicated and cumbersome, and they really don't want to replicate that with anyone.
Theresa May has been at pains to insist she's in the driving seat when it comes to these negotiations, and that she's prepared for anything. But with so much money up for discussion, it may not be such a smooth ride ahead.
Ellie Price reporting. Sadly, she didn't get to keep the car. I've been joined to discuss the Brexit balance sheet by the Director of the Centre for European Reform, Charles Grant, and by Henry Newman, who runs the think tank Open Europe. Welcome to you both. Let me come to you first, Henry Newman. These figures that are being thrown about in Brussels at the moment of an exit bill of between 40 to up to 60 billion, what do you make of them?
I think it's an opening gambit from the institutions, and we should take them seriously. We listened to Mr. Rogers, Ivan Rogers, the former ambassador to Brussels in the House of Commons last week, speaking about the sort of positions that the EU is likely to take in the negotiation. But I think, I personally think the Prime Minister should be more concerned about getting the right sort of trade arrangements subsequent to our departure than actually worrying about the exact detail of the divorce settlement in the bill.
But they might not let her go on to trade until they resolve this matter. Where does the Brexit bill, the cost of exit, if there is to be one, in terms of a sum of money, where does that come in the negotiations? Up front or at the end?
Well, the European Commission has a firm line on this, backed by some other countries, which is you have to talk about the Brexit bill and the divorce settlement before we can get on to talk about the future relationship. And therefore they're saying if you don't sign up for 60 billion-ish, then we won't talk about the future. However, other member states take a softer line than that. Other member states think you probably have to talk about the divorce settlement and the Brexit bill at the same time as the future economic and security relationship. And if you can talk about both at the same time, the atmosphere may be a little bit better natured.
You've been speaking to people in Brussels, and your think tank's produced a fascinating study on the 60 billion. How real is that figure, or is it just an opening gambit?
I think most member states and the EU institutions believe it is, in their opinion, the true figure. But once the negotiations start, I think the numbers will come down. And I think as long as the British are prepared to sign up to the principle of we owe you a bit of money, here's a cheque, then the actual numbers will be, people will compromise.
But what's the ballpark then?
Well, I think you had a figure in your programme just now of 34 billion. That's news to me, and nobody knows yet because the negotiation hasn't started, but I suspect something quite a lot less than 60.
But even 30-odd billion would be politically toxic for a British government, would it not?
I think Theresa May is actually in a very strong position domestically. She's united the Conservative Party. We had, you could expect that coming into this year, all the Conservative divisions would be laid bare by the Article 50 case, Gina Miller at the Supreme Court. In fact, she's leading a united party. It's the Labour Party which are in a political crisis.
Are you saying then she could get away with handing over 30 billion?
I'm saying that we should give her the benefit of the doubt in going into these negotiations. Let her keep her cards relatively close to her chest. In the speech she gave a couple of weeks ago now at Lancaster House, our judgment was that she laid out pretty much as much detail as we could have expected at that point. So I don't think it's helpful now for us to say we shouldn't be introducing further red lines into her negotiation.
I'm not here to be helpful. I'm here to try and find things out. And I would suggest that if there is a bill, let's just say it's 30 billion. Let's make it half of what the current claims coming out of Brussels are. And of course, it won't all have to be paid in 1 year. It's not one cheque, I assume. It'll be spread over. But we'll wait a long time for that 350 million a week or whatever it was that was meant to come from Brussels to spend on the NHS. That's not going to happen for the next 5, 6, 7 years.
Well, I think everyone's been clear that there's going to be a phased exit programme. The Prime Minister has also has been clear on that. But I think the ultimate question of whether something is politically possible for her in terms of the divorce settlement will depend on what she gets from the European Union in those negotiations.
But I'm missing something here. I mean, if she ends up settling for a bill of about 30 billion, which I think would be politically, no matter how popular she is, politically very difficult for her, it does kill any idea that there's a Brexit dividend for Britain.
Well, some of the senior officials in London and also in Brussels are very worried that this particular issue could crash the whole talks, because it may be politically impossible for Theresa May to accept a Brexit bill of 30 billion. So, if there's no deal and we leave the EU without a settlement, then there's massive legal uncertainty. If Article 50, in 2 years, no deal, what contract law applies? Can aeroplanes take off from Heathrow? Nobody knows what legal rights you have if you're an EU citizen living in Britain or vice versa. How could companies operate? So now our partners think this puts them in a very strong position. If there's no deal at the end of 2 years, then we crash out. Disastrous for the British economy, quite bad for the European economy. Therefore, they think they've got all the cards to play, and they are very worried that if it's mishandled domestically in Britain, then we have a crash.
But there will be competing interests in Europe. The attitude of the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, may be quite similar to that of the Nordic states. That in turn may be very difficult from the French or the Germans or the Italians. How will Europe come to a common view on these things?
Well, at the moment they are quite united, backing a fairly strong line pushed by the French, the Germans and the institutions, except perhaps the Poles and Hungarians, who are the bad boys of Europe, who like to be friendly to the Eurosceptic British. And the Irish, who do anything to keep us happy. But there is quite a strong line at the moment. Once the negotiations start, it'll be harder for the EU to keep that line. But we should remember that their priority is not economics. They're not thinking how can they maximise trade with the UK. They are under threat. The combination of Trump and Brexit scare them. They want to keep united, they want to keep together, they want to keep their institutions strong, and that's going to be their...
They also want to keep Britain in the sense of being a major
in terms
geopolitical
of security,
player.
that is the one card that Britain, in my view, the one strong card it has is we contribute to European security.
We know we won't be members of the single market. That is now in the white paper. It was in the Prime Minister's speech at Lancaster House. The situation of the customs union, though, is more nuanced, more complicated, I would suggest. Does that have a cost? If we can be a little bit pregnant in the customs union, does that come with a price ticket?
Well, I think we've also got some clarity on the customs union. The Prime Minister said we're not going to be part of the common commercial policy, so we're not going to be, we will be able to do our own trade deals outside of the EU customs union, and we'll also not be part of the common external tariff. But she's said she's willing to look at other options, and we don't really know exactly what that will be. So we, as a think tank, we're going to be looking at this over the next few weeks and coming up with recommendations for the government and looking at how, for example, existing boundaries between the EU customs union and other states work in practice. So, for example, between Switzerland and the EU border, or between Norway and Sweden, or indeed between America and Canada, where a lot of goods obviously pass across a major international border.
We will want, as a country, the freedom to do our own free trade deals. That seems to be quite high up there. And to change our external tariffs to the rest of the world. If that's the case, we do seem to be wanting our cake and eating it in the customs union.
Well, I think talking to some people in London, it's quite clear we're leaving, as Henry said, the essentials of the customs union, the external tariff. So even if we can minimise controls at the border, the government says, by having what are called mutual recognition agreements, so we recognise each other's regulations and standards, but there'll still have to be checks on the border between Britain and the EU for things like rules of origin and tariffs if tariffs apply, which is a problem for the Irish, because it's very hard to... nobody's worked out how you can avoid having some sort of customs controls on the border between Northern Ireland and the south once we're out of the customs union.
Just on this question of cake and eating it, I think it's important we don't look at this too much as a sort of one side has to win and one side has to lose scenario. We can find ways, and I think my broad view is that what we get out of the negotiation will depend on politics much more than economic reality. The economic reality is very strong. There's a very good case for a very good trade deal, for a solution on the customs deal. But I think Britain will need to come up with a very positive case for our future relationship, as the Prime Minister is doing, and keep making that case.
If it turns out that the government thinks the bill is too high, that we can't really get a free trade deal done in time, and it's left hanging in the wind, what are the chances? How high as things stand now that we end up crashing out?
I say there's a 30% chance that we don't get the free trade agreement at the end of it that Mrs May's aiming for. There are two kinds of crash out, a hard crash and a slightly less hard crash. The very hard crash is you don't even do an Article 50 divorce settlement and then you go straight to World Trade Organization rules. The slightly less hard crash is at least you do the divorce settlement but you don't get the FTA because the transitional arrangements will be too difficult, because transitional arrangements will require European Court of Justice jurisdiction, which the British government won't accept.
We'll leave it there, but come back and keep our commentary for us as these things develop. Thank you both. How serious is this talk of a couple of dozen Tories who were very loyal over voting for the principle of Article 50, but may now be tempted to vote for some amendments to Article 50 legislation that they would find quite attractive?
Well, I think it's certainly, that threat is certainly being taken seriously by Leavers. I spoke to the campaign group Leave Means Leave last night, and they were very worried. The figure that they mentioned was up to 20 Remain supporting Tories. That sounds rather a lot to me, but that is certainly what they're concerned about, and those Tories would come together with Labour and the SNP to vote for that amendment. And although that amendment sounds rather kind of nice and democratic, actually, in the eyes of many Leavers, that is effectively a wrecking amendment, because what you're doing is giving Parliament a sort of veto over whatever deal Theresa May brings back. What they want is the vote to be before that deal is finalised. And it isn't necessarily the case that if Parliament decided they didn't like that deal, we would just go to WTO, we would fall out of the European Union. There are mixed views as to whether we might actually remain in and things could be extended.
My understanding is that the people making the amendments, they want any deal that is done to be brought to Parliament in time, so that if Parliament passes it, then it's done. But if it doesn't just mean go to WTO rules. There would be time either to go back or renegotiate or think again.
Yeah, and the question is about where it puts in Britain's negotiating hand. And actually, neither of the options spell out particularly well for us, because once we trigger that Article 50, the 2-year process begins, the power switches to Europe. It absolutely does. They can run out the clock, and that will be much worse for us than it will be for them. So I don't think there's either option are particularly appealing, frankly. And I think that what has seemed like quite a serene week for Article 50 this week is not going to be reflective of what's going to happen next. I
mean, the way the government's positioning it at the moment, if in the end the only choice Parliament has is to vote for the deal or crash out on WTO rules, then even the Remainers in the end are going to vote for the deal even if they don't like it, because they would regard crashing out as the worst of all possible results.
Possibly, but this is what it's going to be turned into a great game of bluff. If Theresa May manages to fight off any of these amendments on Wednesday, it gets to a straightforward deal or no deal vote. But I've got a funny feeling this amendment may be, if it's chosen, we must remember, because we don't know whether Lindsay Hoyle, the Deputy Speaker whose game it is, will choose this amendment. If it does go to a vote on Wednesday, it'll be very, very tight indeed. And just remember, there is one final thing Theresa May can do if she gets Parliament voting against her, as Isabel would have it, shackling her hands. She can always try and get a new Parliament. Yes, a general election.
Oh no, she could indeed, and would probably get a huge majority to do so. Are the Lords threatened this at all? It goes to the Lords after the February recess. I mean, they're very pro-Europe, but does their instinct for self-preservation overcome their pro-Europeanism?
I think that's exactly it. I mean, you have had some, Patience Wheatcroft this morning, a Tory Lord, was saying, well, actually, I know I am going to vote to block it. I'm going to vote on a conscience measure. But you've got sort of the likes of Bill Cash, a veteran Eurosceptic, sort of kind of suddenly converted to the cause of Lords reform, saying, well, this is an outrage. And I think it's, I doubt they will vote for their own demise, to hasten their own demise by blocking it.
I've been getting away with it all